Hello, everyone. It's so good to see you. Welcome to our write-in. If this is your first time with us, during the write-in, we go through a couple of short prompts and then have an opportunity to just write. So we'll do just a tiny bit of teaching up at the top, but then we have some fun prompts today, all around experimentation kind of with genre and understanding different dimensions of genre and just playing with them to see how they can change our story, and then hopefully also just trying something different. So we will go ahead and dive. Go Bears. You're correct, Clifton. Go Bears. Okay, so if you don't know me, my name is Hayley. I'm the head of education here at ProWritingAid, and I lead our write-ins every month. Oh, Taipei. Oh, I wish I was in Taipei right now. I'm half Taiwanese, and I typically spend a lot of time in Taiwan every year, but haven't been there since early 2020, since the pandemic. So I wish I was in Taiwan right now. Anyway, okay. Oh man, there's a typo on the slide. This should say what even is genre, not what's even is genre. Sorry, everyone. So what even is genre? So many of us understand genre kind of as this high level look at themes in our story. And when we think about genre, we often think about words like, crime or fantasy or romance. And all of those are indeed genres and are typically used for marketing and finding, an ideal audience. However, for us, when it comes to writing, it's often helpful to think about genre as more than just about content. So instead of just what's happening in our story, we can also think about additional dimensions. So we're going to talk about 3 of those today and have 3 sample prompts to go with them. So we'll start with the kind of basic idea of genre that a lot of us have, which is content. So content as a genre, kind of when we're thinking about it in terms of genre, dictates the key themes and ideas of our story. So this genre type answers the question of what the key theme or controlling idea is for your story. What does your protagonist want? So for instance, if you are writing a story that is a romance story, the protagonist in your genre probably wants to find love or end up married or something like that. If you are writing a war story, they probably want to defeat their enemy. If you're writing crime, they might want to solve the crime, or they might want to catch the criminal or something like that. Yes, horror, they might want to survive, right? Exactly. So content kind of dictates what the key goal is for your protagonist. Now we can see how this plays out for readers. So last week I was on vacation, and while I was on vacation, I was reading a bunch of romance novels ahead of our Romance Writers Week, which we will be announcing soon. But I read like 12 romance novels last week, and every single one of those romance novels had the theme of kind of finding true love, right? Every single one. So when you're thinking about content, you're thinking about, what does my audience expect? When I was opening every single one of those romance novels, I was expecting the protagonist to want to find love. I was expecting a love story. I would have been very surprised if I opened a romance novel and, the main theme was about hunting down a murderer or something like that. Like there can always be side stories and things happening, but the key theme is kind of what your audience is expecting. So I would consider a successful romance novel when the pairing ends up together at the end, right? When love conquers all. So when you're thinking about this kind of content area for your specific protagonist, it's important to think about, what are my readers expecting? What kinds of conflicts are they expecting to have? What do they expect our protagonists within this content genre to be motivated by? So that's one thing to think about. Another thing you can think about in terms of genre is reality. So reality relates to the suspension of disbelief. So basically how much your audience is supposed to suspend their disbelief related to your setting and all of the kind of cascading things that can happen from that. So for instance, you might have a realistic genre. So something like Law and Order, where it's obviously a made-up story. However, it's in a realistic world. So if you're, watching Law and Order and all of a sudden someone whipped out like a wand and started performing magic spells, you'd be a little bit confused because you're not supposed to suspend your belief that in that setting. Or yeah, as David's saying, you're supposed to kind of retain you're supposed to retain belief in the realism of the setting of Law and Order. You might have something like Argo, where you are working with like a factual events. And so if you are working with a setting like that, then you're supposed to add in details that kind of make it realistic or make it factual against that world. So if you watch the movie Argo, they are in the same place that the actual historical events happened. The names of the characters are the names of the people who were involved, right? So there is, narrative style applied to the story. However, that's done in a way that kind of sits within the reality of what that story actually was. You can also have something like fantasy or magic or science fiction. In something that's fantastical, your audience is required to suspend their disbelief a lot, right? So in a fantasy story, it's not surprising that someone would whip out a magic wand and cast a spell or something like that. It's not surprising that, there might be creatures that we don't see in the real world and that type of thing. So this relates specifically to your setting. Now, I'm seeing a couple people talk in the chat about stereotypes and tropes of high fantasy. So Kat says, I'm writing high fantasy, but I'm trying to break the stereotypes and tropes where the orcs are always bad and the damsel always needs to be rescued from the dragon, that type of thing. So when Kat is thinking about breaking those high fantasy tropes, Kat needs to think about breaking the tropes related to both reality and content, right? So when you're thinking about tropes about the world, that might be how orcs are always bad. Like that kind of relates to more of reality and more of the setting and the races that are there in that fantastical setting. However, damsel being rescued from dragon relates more to content, right? So that might be about an adventure story and you're trying to break the tropes of an adventure story and tell something realistic. So I want you to think about how content and realism layer on together. So you could have a war story in a fantasy world. Lord of the Rings is a great example of that, right? Like they're trying to defeat the enemy. They're fighting a war in that story. Yes, Kat, this is recorded, don't worry. You could also have a romance story in a fantasy setting, right? You could have a crime story in a fantasy setting, which is like what Six of Crows is, right? You can have all of these different types of stories in a fantasy setting, while you can also have a war story, obviously in a realistic setting. You can have a romance story in a realistic setting, etc. So I often people think that fantasy is like a content genre, but fantasy isn't really specifically related to content. You can tell all types of stories in a fantasy world, okay? So when we're thinking about genre, again, it's helpful to think about it on more layers than this. If we're just thinking like, oh, well, what does my fantasy audience expect? That's really only telling half the story, because a fantasy audience does expect magic, but a fantasy romance audience is going to expect something very different than somebody who's there for fantasy action and adventure, right? So you need to be thinking about genre on multiple levels in order to, confirm your readers' expectations so they don't get in there and feel kind of cheated. And that being said, confirming your readers' expectations has nothing to do with tropes. Like you can definitely turn tropes on their head, you can ignore tropes, etc. But when it comes to the specific themes and what someone's expecting, if I'm coming to a romance fantasy novel, I'm going to expect some magic, but I'm going to expect a love story. So even if that love story doesn't have any tropey scenes or kind of, turns things on its head, that's totally fine. But I expect the story to be about love, and I'll be feeling kind of gypped if it's not. So again, it's important to think about genre on both of those levels. And then another thing that we're going to experiment with today is style. So genre also relates to, how your reader is going to experience your story. So if you're writing something dramatic, they're going to expect, lots of emotional highs and lows and struggles and that type of thing. If you are writing a comedy story, if that's kind of where you're going, they're going to expect to laugh. You could also think about creating something that's a little bit more documentary style. So one of the books that I read last week was Daisy Jones and the Six. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but it's kind of done in like a documentary style, almost written. And so that story was told in a different way, which created a new experience for me as a reader and was a really interesting way of turning a story that could have been kind of tired or could have been something I had seen before on its head. It definitely stood out amongst a lot of the other kind of romance and romance stories I was reading last week because it was like totally different. Yeah. It definitely faked me out as well, Helen. And so I think like that shift in style made it feel really fresh. So, for someone like Kat who's thinking about turning fantasy on its head, you can think about how can I turn the world on its head? How can I turn the content on its head? But also playing around with style can really help your audience feel something a little bit more fresh. You can also think about like an epistolary or letter type style where your characters are writing to each other. That's a really great way to, again, turn a story on its head and give different ways and different kind of creative ideas of thinking about things. So again, the main kind of takeaway I want as we're going into our prompts here in a second is to be thinking about genre as more than just like, I'm writing romance or I'm writing a fantasy story, anything like that. Genre is going to have multiple stages. And so someone in the chat said, my story is a coming of age romance, action, and adventure. So no, I don't think so. I think your story will be like so the action and adventure and the romance, you can have like, I know a couple of people were asking about this in the chat, you can have like a secondary plot, but there will typically be one main story. So yours might be like the main kind of coming of age action and adventure is typically the main story for most coming of age stories. There's usually like action and adventure, and then romance is like a secondary subplot. So typically there's like one main story within that, and then there's a secondary subplot that might fit into something else. So again, like YA novels often have, action and adventure as that person is kind of coming of age. So again, thinking through like, what is my main story? What does the main protagonist want? And trying to boil that down, which we're actually going to get to in just a second with our prompt, trying to boil that down to one thing for the ultimate kind of goal of the story. Then you can always layer in subplots. So that's actually just like a great transition to our prompts for today. So we're going to have 3. And the first is to really just think about our main genre, right? So we were just talking about the person in the chat who's writing something that is kind of coming of age, kind of action and adventure, kind of romance. I want for this first one to kind of figure out our main content genre, to describe your protagonist's main goal throughout the story and trying to boil this down into one sentence. So for instance, a protagonist who is trying to, let me use the Hunger Games, for example, a YA story. So Katniss is trying to overthrow the Capitol, right? That's boiled down to one simplistic sentence. She has romances throughout that with like Gale and Peeta and characters like that. However, that's not the main thing. Same thing in Harry Potter, right? Harry is trying to defeat Lord Voldemort. Does he have love interest through in it? Of course, but his main goal is that. So that's what I want us to think about for this first prompt, is trying to boil your story down to just one sentence about your protagonist's main goal. It can be helpful to think about how your protagonist will know if they've succeeded or failed. And this is a good question to get at kind of the key story. So Harry would defeat Lord Voldemort and still succeed in the book, even if he didn't end up with Ginny, right? Still succeed. So this will be our first prompt. We'll have 5 minutes for this. And then we will come back together and share in the chat. So I am going to start the timer and we will be back in 5 minutes. Okay, our time is up. So for all of you who are finishing up, you can drop in the chat your sentence. Now, I'm going to go through a couple of them, and I do want to encourage some of us who have some of the longer ones to try to boil it down very, very simply. A lot of this is kind of getting into some of the plot points, and that type of thing. So for instance, we've got Catherine, whose main character, Venetia, is trying to have an emotionally fulfilling life. And I think, we have some things about her relationships in there, reconciliation and that type of thing. And I think we could kind of summarize that by saying Venetia's main goal is to have fulfilling relationships in her life or something like that, because it looks like all of Catherine's questions for Venetia are related to people, related to her reconciliation with Violet, relating to somebody forgiving her in the afterlife, that type of thing. So it could be that her main goal is to feel emotionally fulfilled by having deep relationships, right? So very, very simple. And Angela says, mine feels a little boring, which is fine. This is your kind of protagonist's main goal doesn't have to be anything exciting. And I think this is where a lot of us, think, oh, we have to like layer on a bunch. But really, when we're coming to that very first point of genre, which is what the theme of the story is, most of them are very simple. So again, every single one of the 12 romance books I read last week, every single one, the goal for the main person was to fall in love, right? And that's the goal of how the book is successful or not. Obviously, characters are three-dimensional and have other goals for themselves, but within the narrative of the story, the narrative succeeds or fails based on what that character does. So again, for those of us who are feeling oh, I feel a little bit like this is boring, it's not boring. It doesn't mean that you can't have any subplots. Your characters aren't three-dimensional. But when it comes to telling a cohesive story within itself, having one kind of key goal for that helps your story, first helps readers know what kind of story you're going to tell and if it will be interesting to them, but then also just provides a really sharp kind of narrative structure. When we start trying to get too much into that within the conception of genre, we can be confused, right? Our characters can be very three-dimensional, but when it comes to genre, a lot of times we just boil down to one really simple sentence. Okay, so again, like Catherine's, it can be just to have deeper relationships, right? Hayley had one that was when the war is over, they can go home. So yes, winning and going home, right? That's a very, very simple and very specific genre, or very common genre for, or very common goal for war stories. Exactly. And yes, there are external and internal goals, but again, I think, first of all, there are external and internal goals, totally. So a lot of things can happen. And again, most characters have long-term goals and short-term goals and all of that type of thing. But when it comes to the genre of your story, when you're deciding, is this a war story versus is it a romance story, for instance, it could be a war story with romance, or it could be a romance story that takes place during a war. But what it is depends on that ultimate goal, right? So if you're writing a romance, or if you're writing a war story about a soldier who's in love with a woman back home and he wants to return to her, but the main action of the story is him fighting, then that's a war story. If you're writing a story about a soldier who's on leave and, and falls in love and then has to deal with, meet somebody on leave and falls in love with her and, then has to, return to war and ultimately decides to propose or something like that. That's a romance story that takes place during a war. So again, characters can have multi-layers, but when you're coming to okay, how am I marketing this? What is this? What is my true genre? It hinges on what that ultimate goal is for the character. So for the person before who was talking about, am I coming of age? Am I action adventure? Am I this? Am I that? All of that turns exactly to what Barb was saying. Are you writing an action adventure with coming of age elements? Are you writing an action adventure with romance, or are you writing a romance? It's very common to have goals related to romance in other genre stories. Okay. So again, that's very, very common. But when it comes to that very high level of genre, we want to go, what is my, overall goal for this protagonist, then we can also layer some other stuff on there. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to our second prompt, which is where we will try to just have some fun. So our next two prompts are hopefully going to shake us out of some of our normal writing habits, and I want us to try some new things. So now that we have our protagonist's main goals, we're going to try out a couple of styles. So think of a scene for your story. It can be something that you've written already. It can be something that you want to write new. I want you to think about what it would look like in different styles. So some of the styles we thought about were comedy. What would it look like to tell the same scene funny? What would it look like as a drama? What would it look like if it was written as a letter? Would it look like if it was written as a journal interview or a documentary style? So I will, Kat, don't worry, I'll paste the prompt into the chat. But the goal for this 10 minutes is to do two things. Pick one scene and try to write it two ways as much as you can. So try to write it as a comedy and a drama, as a comedy and a letter, as a drama and a documentary, etc. We're going to just see how it goes and see how it feels to try to do something in a different way. So we're going to do it for 10 minutes. I will tell you when we're halfway through and when you should switch styles. And I'll paste this in the chat and we will get started. Okay, it's been about 5 minutes. So now it is time to switch styles and try writing the scene in a different style. Okay, time is up. Some people are dropping a bunch of different options into the chat, which is great. I'd love to hear from you how it felt to try different styles or try something different. I often, oops, this is the wrong one. I often like to try epistolary styles when I am trying to get more in a character's head. So I actually find that to be a really useful tool. Typically I'm writing like third person drama or first person and that type of thing. And so writing in the style of a letter can kind of help me think about how one character would feel in a certain scenario, or how one character would react to something. It can also help me really test voices and stuff like that. Someone did something about observing a character, which is great. Someone said it makes me sad that I don't have a gift for humor, which I understand. I understand much. So yeah, switching to drama totally makes sense. And again, it doesn't always just have to be comedy drama. It could be comedy and a letter. It could be a documentary style. It could be a play. It could be, cinematic or movie style or something like that. But I do think, again, like someone said, that it's actually helpful to reveal plot holes is a good point, because I think, again, trying a different style can really help you see, where have I completed this? Where have I, where am I missing something? What are even additional opportunities? Yes, Judith tried the letter style, which was funny. Yeah, or which was helpful. Again, I think epistolary is really, really helpful for a lot of different situations. And it's hard to convert styles, especially within 5 minutes, but it can be great. Okay, we have one more long prompt that I want to get to, so I'm going to move to that because these sessions go so quickly, but there are some really great options in the chat. I love how people have, again, gone through, I like how a lot of people going into comedy have gone into first person. I find that really interesting, versus third person being, it seems like more for our dramas, where we tend to be third person, and a lot of comedy is coming in first, which is really interesting. Okay, so for our third and final prompt, I want us to think of our reality. So remember, we talked about how reality relates to things like factual. So is this an actual historical event, an actual real place? Is this fantasy? Is it all made up? Is it realistic, like Law and Order, where it's kind of in a real place and in a recognizable time, but none of the people or things are like actually real, right? What I want you to think about is what your reality will be for your story. And then I want you to brainstorm a list of ways you're going to create clues about this style of genre into your story. So for instance, if you are writing a factual story about a real place in history or time, you might say that you are going to, do some research about how to incorporate actual dress of the time and like how people would refer to their clothing at that time. If you're writing fantasy, you might say that you want to include X number of mythical, magical beasts, etc. If you're doing realism, you might say that you want to give hints that it's Chicago or whatever city, but you're going to make up a cafe in Chicago or something like that. So again, for this prompt, I want to think about what your reality is, and then creating a list of ways that you can implement clues to this in your story. Now, again, I want us to think about clues here, because it doesn't always have to be like hitting someone over the head with like, this is magic. We're in 1902. Think about what are some things that can really build this world, and really make it feel like it's fully fleshed out throughout your story, not just in those very specific moments where you're setting up setting. Okay. So we have a kind of a long time for this, 10 minutes, because I want you to think about the breadth of your story. What are different ways that this particular type of genre, the reality genre, is going to show up through your story? It can be a list, you can do it in a scene. You have a number of different options, but let's think about how our reality can show up. Our readers have that clue. So we're going to start the timer and then we'll come back together. Okay, we will bring it back together and you can share in the chat. I agree with someone who said that we've got a number of bestsellers going on. There really are some really great thoughts here. So I love how people have talked about, for instance, using different language and different ways of life. I love that someone has talked about slang. I think that's a really important one for just setting, again, creating that kind of immersive experience for where you are. How are people talking about things, right? How are people speaking to each other? What are mannerisms that people in this setting, real or made up, have? How can we create that kind of immersive experience? Somebody is oh, I love Orphan Black. So somebody's writing some Orphan Black fan fiction, and I feel like that show and then, you know, subsequent fan fiction from it is a great example of, you know, how does science show up, right? That show has like human beings that have different modifications and stuff like that, right? So it's like a realistic world, but there are these kind of these interesting elements layered on, which create this setting. And I think Marv was saying this about science fiction as well, right? Like in some ways you think about science fiction as like, oh, well, this is easy, but how can you layer in, if you were writing a sci-fi romance, right? What role would science fiction play in that romance, right? What role would science play? What role would technology play in that romance? How would two characters who are falling in love on a starship, like what would their day-to-day be like? How would they interact, etc.? What would they be doing? What would they be talking about? All of that type of thing. There's so many different kind of things to talk about when it comes to the reality of your story. And what I take away from the prompts today is that all of these things go into how you write your story. So when you're thinking about genre, you're not just thinking about, oh, am I writing a romance or am I writing fantasy? Even if you say I'm writing romance, that has so many implications for all of the other kind of pieces of your story. And that is just kind of the tip of the iceberg. I want us all to think about genre, again, as not just that first prompt, that very kind of basic, what the goal is, but then beyond that, how does the style that we're writing influence our characters, influence our plot, influence our story, influence how we're telling that story? Can we shake up the style to see places where we have plot holes? How does the reality of our story influence how we're telling it? So it's not just romance, but it's romance in this world. And to create that world and to make that world come alive for our readers, we need to layer all these pieces in. And that's what really creates a compelling world, a compelling story, is when you have not just, this is a romance, but this is a romance on a Florida beach. And because it's a romance on a Florida beach, you know, we talk about this, you know, the feel of the sand or something like that, or we are all, you know, all the locals go to this one spot that everyone goes to, or whatever it is. But again, taking genre one step beyond just, I'm in romance, I'm in I'm in war story, I'm whatever, to think much more layered. And I think that this is a really useful exercise, whether you're a plotter who likes to plan everything out, or whether you're a pantser as well. I think for people who like to just kind of write and see where the story takes them, these types of questions can inform your writing session. It can also inform when you go back to edit. You can go back and edit and think, okay, well, maybe I want to try this scene in a different style to see if there are plot holes, or have I done a good job of displaying the reality in here, and that type of thing. So thank you all so much for joining us. I am so glad that so many people have found this fun and productive. We will be back for our write-in next month, and keep an eye on your email, because we are going to be announcing Romance Week next week, and it's by far our biggest week. If you've been to fantasy or crime yet, Romance Week is going to be huge. We have so many sessions, and we have a truly huge amount of some really exciting bestsellers and all this stuff. We're really pumped for it. So keep an eye out. Even if you don't write romance, I think it's going to be really useful. So keep an eye out next week, and we will see you all then. Bye, everybody.